Sacred Heart Hospital in Portland smells like antiseptic and burnt coffee and the particular exhaustion of fluorescent lights that have burned since 6 a.m. Katie Morrison has been awake since yesterday at the same time. This is her third double shift in 4 days. The math of survival, working 3 shifts to cover rent, her daughter's orthodontist, the electric bill that didn't wait for the temp agency paycheck to clear. Her scrubs are navy blue, faded at the knees from kneeling beside beds. Her left leg carries a slight favor, a memory she doesn't discuss. Inside her jacket pocket, sewn into the lining where no one can see, a faded unit patch sits against her ribs like a heartbeat she left behind. She moves through the corridors with the kind of efficiency that doesn't announce itself. Not hurried. Not slow. The exact speed of someone who has learned what matters and what doesn't. A med cart sits abandoned outside room 407, she pushes it to the supply room without being asked. A family member stands confused at the elevators holding a discharge packet, she points with one hand, already moving toward the next crisis. The night shift nurse hands over a report with visible relief, the kind of relief that comes from someone who knows they're handing their patients to hands that won't let go. Katie has that reputation, though she's been at Sacred Heart exactly 6 months, hired through a temp agency, her background listed as nursing experience and nothing more. The ICU hums with the sound of 7 ventilators breathing in synchronized rhythm. She checks her assignment board. For patients. 2 post-op. 1 sepsis case. 1 decorated Navy SEAL general recovering from emergency surgery, 3 days post-op from a bilateral femoral artery repair, right forearm visible above the blanket. The tattoo on his arm reads Morrison in faded black ink. Senior Chief Katie Morrison stands beside his bed and does not blink. His eyes are morphine-hazed, unfocused. She checks his vitals, blood pressure steady, O2 sat at 96%, heart rate holding at 68. The 4-line runs clear fluid, a 20 gauge in his left arm, the insertion point clean and wrapped precisely. She adjusts the drip rate by 2 milliliters per hour, a minor correction that will prevent the fluid overload his cardiac output can't yet tolerate. Her hands move with military precision, economical, practiced, each motion purposeful. When helicopter rotors echo from the landing pad on the roof 3 floors above, her hands tremble slightly. Just slightly. Just for 1 breath. Then they steady. The general's eyes flutter. They don't focus on her. She touches her jacket pocket unconsciously, a gesture so small no one would recognize it as anything but nervous habit. The unit patch is still there. It has been there for 6 months, sewn into the lining, staying close, staying hidden, the way she has learned to stay hidden. Dr. James Sterling observes from the nurse's station. He is tall in the way that private school and inherited money make men tall, not from bearing or muscle, but from the confidence that the world was built to fit his proportions. He wears a Rolex Submariner, reference 116610, the model that costs $12,400 at retail, though his came from a friend at the country club who had bought it in 2011 and never wore it. He has watched Katie Morrison for 3 weeks with the calculation of a man who notices things that might become problems. The way she moves. The way other nurses defer to her decisions without anyone telling them to. The way she catches his mistakes before he can hide them. 3 weeks ago, he ordered a level 1 rapid infuser for room for 12 when normal for flow would have been sufficient. The equipment alone cost the hospital $847,000 as part of the contract Sterling negotiated with the vendor, a vendor that paid him a consulting retainer of $4,200 per month in exchange for his influence on purchasing decisions. The purchase order went through on a Tuesday morning. Katie Morrison asked him, quietly, in the hallway outside the break room, whether the patient's blood pressure stability might actually contraindicate the rapid infuser protocol. She didn't challenge him. She only suggested. 1 sentence. Polite. Deferential. The kind of question that seemed almost apologetic. But Sterling understood what it meant. It meant she was thinking about the orders. It meant she was checking against protocol. It meant, eventually, if she stayed long enough, she would ask why his purchases never aligned with actual clinical need. She's still too new to be a threat. But threats don't announce themselves. Threats build slowly. This morning, Katie finishes rounds at 8:24 a.m. Her shift ends at 9 a.m. She has 42 minutes to chart and sign off and walk to her car, where she has a 14-minute commute to her daughter Emma's middle school, where she will pick her up at 3:15 p.m., drive her to her grandmother's house for after-school care, and then return to Sacred Heart at 6 p.m. for her evening shift. The math of survival requires precision. It requires never being late. It requires that no one know how thin the wire is. She stands at the nurse's station, charting the general's noon medications, a prophylactic antibiotic, a blood thinner to prevent clot formation, a pain management protocol that will need to shift in 2 days when his mobility increases. Sterling approaches. He moves like a man who has never questioned his right to enter any room, speak to any person, take any space he decides he needs. He stops beside her at the desk. Close enough that she can smell his cologne, something expensive, probably Creed Aventus, the kind of scent that announces itself before the man does. He smiles. It's the smile of a predator measuring a potential threat and deciding, for now, it's manageable. Katie. How was the night shift? She doesn't look up from her charting. This is part of the trick she has learned, appearing small enough that people forget she occupies space at all. Stable. General's vitals are consistent. No complications with the femoral repair site. Good. Good. I noticed you adjusted his infusion rate this morning. It's not a question. He's testing her the way a man tests ice by walking on it, listening for the crack. Patient's cardiac output suggested a lower rate would prevent fluid overload. She uses the passive voice deliberately. Not I adjusted. Not I noticed. The science did this. The medicine did this. She is only the instrument. Standard protocol. Yes, sir. The hesitation is so small that Sterling almost misses it. Almost. But he's listening for it, the way a hunter listens for the exact moment a deer recognizes danger. The hesitation means she's considered something, whether to mention the protocol, whether to trust it, whether to speak at all. The hesitation means thought. Observation. Competence that might eventually become inconvenient. He places his hand on her shoulder. The gesture is familiar, collegial, the kind of touch that a senior physician gives a nurse. You're doing good work here. Really good work. But remember, we trust our evidence-based protocols for a reason. They keep us from second-guessing ourselves. From overthinking. Katie Morrison looks up at him for the first time. Her eyes are the color of a stormy Atlantic, and they carry the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse things than this conversation. She doesn't flinch. She doesn't look away. She doesn't blush or shrink or apologize. I'm familiar with evidence-based protocol. I follow it. I'm sure you do. He removes his hand. His smile doesn't change. But something in his expression has hardened, crystallized from curiosity into calculation. Just make sure you understand the hierarchy here. Nurses execute protocols. Doctors determine them. It works better for everyone when those lines stay clear. He walks away before she can respond. That's important too, he doesn't give her the opportunity to have the last word. He controls the exit. He controls the frame. Katie Morrison sits very still for exactly 7 seconds. Then she returns to her charting. Her hands do not shake. Her jaw does not clench. Her breathing does not change. This is the thing that 23 years of military service had taught her, the thing that deployments to Ramadi, to Helmand Province, to the places where people died when you made mistakes, had carved into her bones. Control is a choice. The trembling isn't fear. The trembling is restraint. The choice not to let the world see what she's actually made of. So she sits at the nurse's station of Sacred Heart Hospital in Portland, in her faded navy scrubs, with her hidden unit patch and her careful invisibility, and she charts the vitals of a general she doesn't recognize and a doctor who doesn't recognize her, and she understands that something has shifted. He's noticed her. And everything that comes next, every calculation, every order, every decision Sterling makes from this moment forward, will be designed with one specific purpose in mind, making sure that Katie Morrison doesn't stay long enough to become a problem. Dr. Sterling's voice cut through the patient's room like a blade. Katie had suggested a standard DVT prophylaxis adjustment, a clinical observation, nothing more, and his response was immediate, surgical in its cruelty. The patient's daughter sat rigid in the corner chair, her husband's hand gripping hers. "Nurse Morrison," Sterling said, his tone dripping condescension, "when I need protocol suggestions from someone with your limited credentials, I'll ask." He didn't look at Katie. He looked at the family, performing for an audience. "Until then, confine yourself to bedpans and vitals." Katie's hands remained steady on the fall line. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. The suggestion she'd made, a 5 mg adjustment to the prophylaxis dosage based on the patient's creatinine clearance, was textbook. Standard. The kind of thing any competent nurse would catch. But that was exactly the problem. Sterling needed her to seem incompetent. He needed her to seem dangerous. He needed everyone watching to believe that her presence on this unit was a liability. "This is exactly why temps shouldn't handle complex cases," Sterling continued, his voice carrying through the open doorway. Nurses in the hallway paused. He knew they were listening. "You're out of your depth, sweetie." The word hung there. Sweetie. Designed to diminish, to infantilize, to make her seem small. The patient's daughter flinched. Katie took one measured breath. She kept her eyes on the fall line, finished securing the dressing, and then she looked up. Directly at Sterling. Without looking away, she let a single tear escape, not from fear, not from pain, but from the crystalline clarity of understanding exactly what was happening and the exhaustion of watching it happen anyway. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact. "I've carried dying men through remedy with more grace than you've shown today," Katie said quietly. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't crack. It was steady as a surgical laser, and every syllable carried the weight of someone who had actually seen what grace looked like when it mattered. Sterling's face reddened. His jaw clenched. He wasn't expecting defiance. He was expecting tears, apologies, retreat. Instead, he'd gotten something infinitely more dangerous, a woman who had nothing left to prove to him and knew it. He dismissed her with a wave, turning back to the patient with a forced smile. Katie finished her charting, moved out into the hallway without hurrying, and continued to the next room. Her shift continued. Her hands continued their work. The message, however, had been delivered. But that wasn't the worst part. The break room was where Sterling's real strategy crystallized. Katie sat down at the small table by the window, unpacking her lunch, a sandwich she'd made at 5 a.m., now 6 hours old. She set down her water bottle with a soft clink against the laminate. 3 nurses sat at the adjacent table. Jennifer, the charge nurse from day shift. Marcus, who'd trained with Katie on her first week. Diane, who'd smiled at her yesterday while reviewing discharge summaries. Katie opened her sandwich. Jennifer immediately stood. Her coffee was still steaming. She hadn't finished it. "We have to." Jennifer started, not looking at Katie. "We have to get back." Marcus and Diane followed. No words. No eye contact. 3 chairs scraped against tile in rapid succession. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum above the sink. Katie sat alone with 3 steaming coffee cups arranged around the room like abandoned monuments. She ate her sandwich anyway. She didn't look up. She didn't acknowledge them. Her hands didn't tremble. But she understood. The message Sterling had delivered in that patient's room wasn't just to her. It was to everyone. Stand with her and you're next. Question me and you're incompetent. Defend her and you're out. The isolation was weaponized. Institutional. Clinical in its precision. That afternoon, the unit board outside the break room bore a fresh posting. A formal write-up. Katie's name circled in red marker by someone's hand, Sterling's hand, most likely, performing the act for whoever passed by. The document was brief, clinical, devastating. 2 board members had already signed it. Not 3. Just 2. Enough to make it official. Enough to create the perception of consensus without actually achieving it. Katie read it once. She didn't take it down. She didn't challenge it. She didn't cry. Her jaw tightened, barely perceptible. The trembling wasn't fear, it was restraint, the kind of restraint that comes from having already survived things that would break ordinary people, but her face remained composed. The temp nurse who thinks she knows better than doctors, she heard whispered as she passed a medication station. Jennifer's voice, but not Jennifer's words. Those were Sterling's words, dispersed like a virus through the unit's nervous system. Katie continued to room for 12. Room for 15. Room for 18. She took vitals. She documented findings. She adjusted pain medication based on patient assessment and the numbers that matter, 2 mg increments of morphine, 0.5 mg increments of dexmedetomidine. She was precise. She was competent. She was exactly the threat Sterling had identified. At 3:36 p.m., she passed the ICU where a general lay recovering from emergency surgery. His right forearm was visible above the blanket, and there, in faded ink that had survived 2 decades and 3 continents, was a tattoo. A name. Morrison. Her surname. The name she'd left behind when she became a civilian nurse working shifts at Sacred Heart in Portland, Oregon, under credentials that listed nothing of who she'd actually been. The general's eyes were closed, his morphine drip steady at 2 milligrams per hour. The machines around his bed beeped their rhythmic patterns. He didn't see her. He wouldn't have recognized her even if he had, not yet. Not in this state. The past was sealed in amber, and Katie had made peace with that. But peace had a shelf life. She finished her shift at 7 p.m. The parking lot was dark, rain beginning to fall in the way it only falls in Portland, not a storm, but a commitment. Water hammered the asphalt like applause for something that wasn't happening. Katie sat in her car for 14 minutes before driving home. The house was dark when she arrived. Emma's backpack was slung over a kitchen chair, soccer uniform draped over the back. Katie didn't turn on the lights. She sat at the kitchen table in her scrubs, still wearing her hospital badge, her jacket still buttoned because she hadn't found the energy to remove it. At 2:13 p.m. the next day, Emma found her there. Her daughter stood in the doorway, still in her school uniform, and Katie realized she'd been sitting at that table for nearly 20 hours. The afternoon light came sideways through the window, illuminating dust particles and the space between intention and collapse. "Mom." Emma's voice was small. Confused. "Why are you home early?" Katie looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and something in her chest that had been held together with discipline and routine began to fracture. Emma was 16. Tall enough now that her eyes were nearly level with Katie's. She had her father's face, which meant she had Katie's stubbornness underneath it, and that was a problem because it meant she could read the lie coming from 50 yards away. "Just a staffing change, honey," Katie said. Emma crossed the kitchen. She didn't sit down. She leaned against the counter and her eyes narrowed in that particular way that meant she was running the numbers and they weren't adding up. "Did something happen?" Emma asked. Katie couldn't explain Sterling. Couldn't explain the weaponized compassion that had transformed her clinical observation into insubordination, her competence into a threat. Couldn't explain the protocol she'd suggested because she'd carried men through remedy with wounds that should have been incompatible with survival and learned to read the difference between clinical presentation and death sentence in a voice's inflection. She couldn't explain the PTSD, either. Emma knew her mother woke sometimes at 3 a.m. with her hand moving toward a weapon that didn't exist beside a bed where no one was trying to kill her. Emma had learned to recognize the sound of a helicopter as something that would make Katie move to the interior of the house, away from windows. Emma had grown up understanding that her mother carried weight that had nothing to do with physically carrying anything at all. But Katie had never told her daughter where that weight had come from. Had never explained the tattoo that matched the one on a general's arm. Had never said the words, Navy SEAL. Senior Chief Petty Officer. 3 tours. Ramadi. The men she couldn't save. The reason she'd chosen a quiet nursing job under civilian credentials and told no one, not even Emma, who she'd been. Just work, Katie said. Emma moved forward and hugged her mother. Her arms came around Katie's shoulders, and Katie felt the way her daughter's hands trembled slightly, the way Emma was scared but trying not to show it. She felt like someone who'd been given 18 years to adjust to her mother being civilian when her mother was anything but. Katie's phone buzzed. She pulled it out. A text from the staffing coordinator, *Sacred Heart requesting emergency coverage. General's condition deteriorating. Can you be back by 1900, *. Katie stared at the message. Then she stared at her daughter. Emma pulled back from the hug. You have to go back, Emma said quietly. Someone needs you. The drive to Sacred Heart took 14 minutes. Katie's hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel, and somewhere between Burnside and the hospital parking lot, something shifted. The civilian nurse slipped sideways. The woman who'd been trained to handle asymmetrical chest walls and tension pneumothorax and decisions that happened in 3-second windows began moving toward the surface. The ICU doors opened at 6:53 p.m. The monitors were alarming. The general's chest was asymmetrical, the left side not rising with each ventilation. His oxygen saturation was dropping. 89, 87. 85, his breathing was labored, shallow, the sound of a man suffocating from inside his own chest cavity. Tension pneumothorax. Collapsed lung. The kind of complication that happened sometimes after emergency surgery if the drain wasn't positioned precisely. The kind of complication that killed people in 4 minutes if no one acted. Katie moved before the code team arrived. The monitor screamed first. One continuous wail that turned every head in the ICU toward bed 4, where the general lay recovering from what should have been routine post-operative stabilization. His chest rose, but only on one side. The left side stayed still, caved inward like a fist closing. Katie was 3 beds away, checking a peripheral line on a post-surgical cardiac patient, and she heard it before she processed the visual, the absence of breath sounds on the left. Not diminished. Absent. The kind of silence that meant air was filling the space where his lungs should expand. Tension pneumothorax. For minutes to cardiac collapse if the pressure wasn't released. She moved. Not fast. Smooth. The way you move when your body remembers things your mind hasn't caught up to yet. Muscle memory didn't hesitate. It didn't check the chain of command. It moved like someone who'd performed this procedure in Ramadi with IED shrapnel whistling past her helmet, where hesitation meant another man didn't make it home. The resident froze. Both of them. They stood on either side of the bed, staring at the monitor as if the numbers themselves might reverse if they looked hard enough. Systolic pressure dropping. Oxygen saturation plummeting. 94, 88. 82, the general's face was pale, his jaw clenched, and his eyes, conscious, lucid, locked onto Katie's as she moved to his bedside with a tourniquet in one hand and a 14-gauge angiocath needle in the other. Second intercostal space, she said to the frozen residents. Not a question. Not a request. A statement. Midclavicular line. Get me a chest tube kit. Now. One resident snapped to motion. The other stayed frozen, mouth open, watching. Katie didn't wait. She had done this in field conditions with dust storms reducing visibility to 10 meters, with incoming fire making the air itself hostile. A sterile ICU at Sacred Heart was the easiest version of this procedure she'd ever attempted. She prepped the site with one swift alcohol swab, her hand steady as surgical steel, and felt the anatomical landmarks beneath her fingertips, the second rib, the space below it, the midclavicular line where the needle would go. She didn't announce what she was doing. The doing was the communication. The needle slid through skin and muscle and fascia in one fluid motion. She felt the subtle resistance, then the sudden give as the needle penetrated the parietal pleura. And then, the unmistakable hiss. Air escaping. Pressure releasing. The sound of a man's chest cavity finally allowing his lungs to breathe again. The monitor beeped. Once. Twice. A pattern reasserting itself. Oxygen saturation 82. Then 86. Then 91. The general's ribcage expanded on the left side, finally rising in sync with the right. His face shifted from the grey-white of hypoxia toward something closer to living color. His eyes, still locked on Katie's, reflected something between gratitude and recognition that she immediately noted and filed away. Left lung re-expanded, Katie said quietly, her voice level as if she were calling out normal vital signs instead of having just prevented cardiac arrest in front of a room full of hospital staff. Breath sounds returning across the left field. We still need the chest tube before he reaccumulates. The resident who'd snapped a motion was already running. The other one was still standing, staring at Katie as if she'd just performed a surgery with her bare hands instead of a standard emergency decompression that any trained medical professional should know how to execute. The silence in the ICU was so thick you could have operated in it. Katie continued documenting as if she'd just checked a blood pressure reading. She noted the time of the procedure, 14:13. The indication. The technique. The immediate response. Her handwriting didn't waver. Her hands didn't shake. This was what competence looked like, not trembling, not seeking praise, just moving through the crisis with the quiet authority of someone who'd done worse things in worse places and lived to document them afterward. The code team arrived 43 seconds later, their shoes slapping the tile floor in a synchronized rhythm that meant they were moving fast but not panicked. They found an ICU that had already handled the emergency, a patient who was already stabilized, and a temp nurse from the staffing agency calmly entering the final details into the electronic medical record as if she hadn't just bypassed every authorization requirement in the hospital's protocols. Dr. Sterling appeared within the hour. He didn't come from concern. The nursing supervisor had paged him with language carefully chosen to convey alarm, an authorized invasive procedure performed by temporary nursing staff on General Morrison. You may want to respond to this situation. Sterling arrived in his white coat, moving through the ICU with the casual confidence of a man who'd never questioned his own authority, and found Katie at the medication cart checking the chest tube drainage rate on the general's chart. She heard him before she saw him. The slight clearing of throat. The way his footsteps syncopated with the ventilator's rhythm. When she turned, his face was arranged in an expression that mimicked concern but contained no actual worry, just calculation. A man trying to decide which pressure point to use. ICU, now, he said. Not to Katie directly. To the space near Katie, the way you give orders to someone you've already decided doesn't deserve eye contact. The hallway outside the ICU smelled like antiseptic and, oddly, like the coffee someone had spilled near the sink. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with that particular frequency that made Katie's jaw clench slightly, the same frequency as helicopter rotors, though she didn't acknowledge that connection. Sterling closed the door behind them and leaned against it with the posture of someone who expected to be standing there for a while. You performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization, he began, his voice carrying the rehearsed tone of someone reciting grounds for dismissal. On a general officer. In a federally funded hospital. That's not just insubordination. That's grounds for immediate termination, license review, and potential legal action against both you and Sacred Heart. Katie's voice, when she responded, came from the lower register it had occupied about 12 minutes ago. The voice that issued commands. The voice that expected compliance. Standing orders for acute respiratory distress in post-operative cardiac patients include emergency needle decompression. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. I followed protocol. Sterling's smile appeared slowly, the way a knife blade catches light. We'll let the board decide what protocol you followed. And what authorization you had to follow it. He made the first call within 15 minutes of returning to his office. Katie heard about it through the nursing supervisor, who'd been called directly, an emergency termination meeting scheduled for 7 o'clock the following morning. Then the second call, to an outside risk management consultant whose entire job was to build termination files so airtight that wrongful termination lawsuits evaporated in depositions. The consultant was already compiling documentation. The third call went to the temp agency that had placed Katie, and Sterling's tone during that conversation had been almost friendly. He was just asking routine questions about any gaps in employment history, any red flags in her background, anything that might explain why someone would bypass hospital protocols. Why someone might be unstable enough to make dangerous decisions without oversight. Katie didn't know about these calls yet. She was still in the ICU, still doing her job, still moving through the evening shift with the same quiet competence that had saved the general's life 43 minutes ago. But she could feel the shift in the air, the way co-workers who'd been distant before suddenly started avoiding eye contact entirely. The way conversation stopped when she approached. The way the nursing supervisor who'd been sympathetic about the public humiliation now wore an expression of professional distance that meant she was protecting herself from association. The department needed witnesses. The department needed cover. The department needed Katie gone, and it needed to document that the decision had been inevitable all along. Dr. Sterling sat at his desk at 16:22 and drafted an email to the hospital administrator, copying the chief medical officer and the risk management team. The email was a masterpiece of strategic language. It didn't describe what Katie had done correctly. It described what she'd failed to do wrong. She hadn't sought authorization, hadn't waited for the code team, hadn't allowed proper channels to handle the crisis. Each omission became evidence of instability. Each correct medical decision became proof of dangerous judgment. The email ended with a single sentence that sealed everything. I believe this employee represents a significant liability risk to the institution and recommend immediate separation of employment pending investigation. Katie received the notification to report to the administrator's office at 7 o'clock on a slip of paper handed to her by the nursing supervisor at the end of her shift. No explanation. No context. Just a time and a place and the unspoken understanding that when you were called to the administrator's office with Dr. Sterling's endorsement, you didn't bring your hopes. You brought your badge and the contents of your locker. She walked to her car in the Portland rain, which had shifted from a soft evening mist to something heavier and more insistent. The kind of rain that hammered against the windshield like it was trying to break through. Her hands gripped the steering wheel at 10:02, exactly as taught in every defensive driving course she'd ever taken, and she didn't let herself think about what the meeting would contain. She didn't let herself calculate how many days of temp assignment she had left. She didn't let herself remember that her daughter had been asking why rent was so tight, or whether the medications would still be covered if she lost the insurance the temporary position provided. What she did was drive home through the rain, pull into a driveway that suddenly felt temporary, unlock a door that suddenly felt borrowed, and sit at a kitchen table in a jacket she still hadn't removed while her daughter, 17 years old, home from school, came around the corner and stopped. The look on Emma's face shifted from casual to something sharper. Something that recognized crisis. Because Katie's hands were folded on the table in a way that meant she was holding herself together by will alone, and her eyes were focused on something in the middle distance that Emma's teenage brain correctly identified as devastation that hadn't been allowed to fully land yet. Mom. Emma's voice went small. Why are you home? Katie sat at the kitchen table at 2 in the afternoon, still wearing her hospital jacket, the polyester clinging to her shoulders like a second skin. The house was silent except for the refrigerator's low hum and the rain hammering the Portland streets outside. She hadn't turned on the lights. She hadn't made coffee. She'd come home early for the first time in 11 years, and the weight of that fact pressed down on her chest like a patient monitor flatlining, that moment when the machine stops making promises. Her hands rested flat on the table. They were steady. That was the thing about Katie Morrison that Dr. Sterling had fundamentally misunderstood. Her hands didn't shake when her world collapsed. They got quieter. More precise. Like a sniper's breathing before the trigger squeeze. The emergency meeting had lasted 17 minutes. Sterling had arranged 3 chairs facing one, his theater of humiliation perfected through years of practice. Dr. Hayes from cardiology and Administrator Marcus Chen, both men whose foursomes with Sterling at Pumpkin Ridge had become more valuable than their oaths to patients. The termination file sat on the table like a weapon already loaded. Falsified timestamps claiming Katie had administered unauthorized medication. Statements from nurses saying she'd been erratic, unstable, a safety risk. One quote attributed to Jennifer Martinez claiming Katie had suggested harmful deviations from protocol. Sterling had even retrieved Katie's employment history from the temp agency, gaps between assignments that meant nothing except to someone determined to find instability. He'd weaponized her silence, her humility, her desire to simply work and go home. "This will be quick," Sterling had said outside the conference room, his voice carrying that surgeon's confidence that comes from never being told no. "Sign the resignation and we'll skip the formal hearing. It's more dignified that way." Katie had asked to check on the general first. A simple request. The ICU wasn't her patient anymore, she'd been restricted from patient care pending investigation. Sterling had stepped into her path, his body language the same a boxer uses before the first bell. "You're restricted. From patient care. Pending investigation." Each word separated like a punch. Emma had been there, sitting in the waiting room with her phone clutched in her white-knuckled hands, terrified that the mother she barely recognized was about to lose her job. Terrified because Katie hadn't explained anything. What was there to say? Your mom saved a general's life by breaking the rules. Now the rules are breaking her. Katie had looked at her daughter, then at Sterling. She'd taken one measured breath. Let it out slow. The silence had lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then, "You've mistaken silence for weakness." Not shouted. Not emotional. Just stated. Like someone reading vital signs. She'd walked past him into the ICU. The general had been conscious, his eyes tracking her movement the way wounded men learn to do, knowing that medical personnel who move fast usually bring pain, and medical personnel who move slow usually bring hope. Katie had checked his chest tube drainage without speaking, her hands moving through the assessment like muscle memory rewriting itself into legitimate skill. The tube was clear. The dressing was intact. His oxygen sat 94%. The entire hospital staff had gathered outside the glass-walled ICU. Nurses and residents and administrators pressing against the transparent barrier like spectators at an execution they didn't understand they were witnessing. Sterling had pushed through them, his face flushed with the red heat of a man losing control of his narrative. The general had gripped Katie's hand. His palm was dry, his grip strong for a man 3 days post-op. His eyes had focused on her face with the sudden clarity of recognition, and his mouth had formed around a single word hoarse and barely audible, "Reaper." The ICU had fallen silent. Not hospital silent, that ambient hum of machines and whispered codes. True silent. The kind of silence that makes fluorescent light sound like they're screaming. Sterling had frozen. Emma had stepped forward from where she'd been watching through the glass, her voice quiet but carrying across the unit like an order, "Senior Chief Petty Officer." The words had hung there like a challenge nobody expected. Marcus Chen, the administrator himself, had pulled out his phone with trembling hands. His wife's brother was Navy, carrier pilot, and Marcus knew enough to understand he was standing in the presence of something that didn't match the file sitting in Sterling's office. He'd scrolled to Katie's service record, his voice cracking as he read aloud to the crowding staff, Katie Morrison. United States Navy SEALs. Senior Chief Petty Officer. Special Warfare Combat Medic. Deployed Iraq 2009. Afghanistan 2011. Afghanistan 2013. 100 staff members had pressed against the glass, their collective breath fogging the transparent barrier. The general had struggled to sit upright despite the chest tube still draining into a canister beside his bed. His voice had carried across the unit with the weight of command, each word deliberate, Bronze Star with Valor. He'd paused, letting that settle. 2 Purple Hearts. Another pause. Navy Cross for carrying 5 wounded men through enemy fire in Ramadi while taking shrapnel to the leg. He'd pointed to the limp nobody at Sacred Heart had understood. She carried me 3 miles. I got her name tattooed so I'd never forget. He'd touched the faded Morrison tattoo on his forearm, the edges blurred by 18 years, but the letters still visible. Still sacred. Jennifer Martinez, the nurse who'd stood and left the break room without a word, had gasped, "She saved a general." "She saved 5 of us," the general had said. His voice had the quality of someone speaking from a memory so deep and true that it superseded all other authority. "We called her Reaper because she brought us back from the dead. This woman has more honor in one finger than most people carry in a lifetime." Emma had pulled out her phone with the slow deliberation of someone producing evidence. A photograph, young Katie in combat gear, face streaked with blood and dust, carrying a wounded seal through sand that looked like it was trying to swallow them both whole. The crowd had erupted in whispers, that sound building like wind through canyon walls. Sterling had tried to speak, but the general had cut him off with nothing more than a look, the kind of look that comes from command authority that doesn't require a uniform to enforce. That was when the FBI agents had appeared at the ICU entrance. Senior Agent Richardson had stepped forward, her credentials already in hand, her eyes carrying the cold precision of 3 months of investigation. "We've been investigating billing fraud at Sacred Heart for 3 months, Dr. Sterling. The equipment ordering irregularities. The procedure charges that don't match patient records. The falsified invoices totaling approximately $247,000. She'd paused. "We need to speak with you." Sterling had opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again like a fish pulled from water. "I want to speak to my attorney," he'd finally managed. The agent had nodded once. "Of course. But first, we'll need to discuss the federal crime you committed when you forged Katie Morrison's personnel records to justify her termination. Falsifying employment documentation is a Class B felony. That's in addition to the fraud charges. You've given us everything we needed to proceed." Katie had stood there in the center of the ICU, the general's hand still gripping hers, surrounded by 100 people who were only now beginning to understand that the quiet nurse they dismissed as unqualified had been carrying them all through her own remedy for months, not through enemy fire, but through something just as dangerous, the recognition of a man's corruption and the choice to save lives anyway, knowing it would cost her everything. Emma had moved to her mother's side. They hadn't spoken. They'd simply stood together while the FBI led Dr. Sterling out of Sacred Heart, past the break room where he'd orchestrated Katie's exile, toward a future that involved folding tables and insurance policies and the permanent knowledge that he'd lost to someone he'd decided was nothing. Katie had finally let herself breathe. The general's eyes opened at 6:36 a.m., 2 days after the needle between his ribs had released the pressure that was collapsing his lung. The ICU held its breath, literally, every monitor, every ventilator, every breath held in anticipation. Katie was checking his chest tube when his focus sharpened. Not the morphine glaze. Not the sedated drift. Real presence. Real cognition. His eyes found hers and locked. One word escaped his lips, barely audible, but it carried the weight of 18 years and 3 continents, Reaper. The room froze. Not surprise, recognition. Recognition is heavier than surprise. It has history. Katie didn't blink. She simply nodded and continued her work, her hands moving with the same clinical precision that had saved his life 48 hours earlier. But something inside her shifted. The armor she'd worn for 2 years, the quiet acceptance, the submissive posture, the nurse who didn't speak unless spoken to, began to separate from her skin like a shed scale revealing something harder underneath. Emma was standing in the corner of the ICU, having insisted on coming to the hospital despite Katie's repeated assurances that everything was fine, that there was nothing to worry about, that Mom had it handled. Emma had watched her mother for 2 years absorbing humiliation in silence. She'd watched Katie come home with the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying more than physical weight. So when Emma heard that word, Reaper, her entire understanding of who her mother was recalibrated in a single second. She stepped forward. Her voice was small but steady, the voice of a 17-year-old girl who'd finally understood why her mother sometimes froze at helicopter sounds, why certain news reports made her leave the room, why there were scars on her shoulders that looked like they'd been made by something that hadn't been meant for civilian skin. "Senior Chief Petty Officer," Emma said quietly. Not a question. A statement. A confirmation that she'd known all along. That Katie had trusted her with the truth weeks ago, over kitchen table coffee at 2 a.m., when the armor finally cracked. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Marcus, the Navy veteran who'd worked ICU nights for 4 years without knowing the woman beside him was a legend, pulled up Katie's service file on the terminal. His hand shook as he read, not from fear, but from the weight of information suddenly making sense. He read aloud, his voice gaining strength with each word. 2 pages. Not just 2 pages. 2 pages of decorations and deployments, of operational summaries and commendations, of dates that mapped onto Katie's absence from civilian life. The hospital was watching. They were always watching, but now they were truly seeing. The general gripped Katie's hand, the same hand that had held his chest open with a surgical needle, that had released air from his pleural space with the calm of someone who'd done harder things in worse places. His voice, when it came, carried across the ICU like a bell tolling something final. Bronze star with Valor. Each word its own sentence. Silver star. The staff leaned in. 2 purple hearts. Someone in the hallway had stopped walking. And a Navy Cross for carrying 5 wounded men through enemy fire in Ramadi. His fingers tightened on Katie's wrist. That's who you are. Not who she'd been pretending to be. Who she actually was. The doors to the ICU burst open at 8:15 a.m., but these weren't the usual hospital entries. Special Agent Richardson from the Federal Bureau of Investigation walked through with 2 colleagues, their presence altering the pressure of the room itself. They'd been investigating Sterling's billing fraud for 3 months, the ghost procedures, the equipment orders that didn't match actual surgical use, the $847,000 in skimmed supplies funneled through 3 shell companies. But when Sterling had attempted to forge Katie's personnel records to justify her termination, he'd crossed into federal obstruction territory. What was once white-collar fraud became conspiracy to conceal federal crime. Richardson found Sterling in his office, still in his white coat, still rehearsing the narrative he'd constructed. A nurse violated protocol. A doctor protected patient safety. An investigation into and sanctioned procedures. The story was neat. The story was clean. The story was about to evaporate. Dr. Evan Sterling, Richardson said, reading the rights with the precision of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. You're under arrest for healthcare fraud, document forgery, and obstruction of federal investigation. Sterling's face drained to the color of old linen. He tried once. I was protecting the hospital. You tried to fire a decorated war hero to cover financial crimes, the general's voice boomed from down the hallway. He was mobile now, despite strict bed rest protocols, and nobody was stopping him. His presence in that moment was like a door opening onto a landscape everyone had been wrong about. The board members Sterling had golfed with for years stepped back, hands raised, bodies creating distance. The risk management consultant, the one who'd built the termination file with frightening efficiency, quietly closed his laptop and walked toward the exit. There was nothing to salvage here. No narrative to rescue. No power structure to protect once the federal government showed up with documentation. Richardson opened a folder. Falsified surgical equipment orders. Ghost procedures billed to Medicare. Kickbacks from suppliers. The dates align perfectly. The week Katie had mentioned the unusual suture order, the week she'd asked a clinical question that suggested she was paying attention, Sterling had written the first of her fabricated disciplinary notes. The write-up on the unit board wasn't about her clinical judgment. It was about removing a threat before she threatened him. Katie's supposed insubordination. Her failure to maintain professional boundaries. All of it fabricated the same week she'd questioned protocol. All of it a calculated erasure. The handcuffs closed around Sterling's wrists with a sound like a door locking. He passed through the break room on his way out, the same space where he'd orchestrated Katie's exile, where nurses had stood and left without a word. Jennifer, Marcus, and Diane watched through the doorway, their shame visible in the set of their shoulders. Sterling tried one final deflection as they moved him toward the lobby. She still violated protocol with that decompression. She followed standing orders and saved my life, the general's voice cut through like a blade. You tried to destroy hers to hide theft. There's a hierarchy of crimes, Doctor. You'll sit at the bottom. The perp walk through Sacred Heart's main lobby was something the news cameras caught beautifully. Handcuffs. FBI jackets. The man who'd been institutional power personified reduced to a federal defendant. His trial would conclude 6 months later with felony convictions and a revoked medical license. But that moment, that walk past the staff he'd manipulated, past the hospital he'd looted, past the woman whose life he'd tried to end, that moment was his real sentence. Katie sat quietly beside the general's bed afterward, Emma holding her hand. Neither of them spoke. Words felt insufficient, inadequate to the weight of what had shifted. 2 years of carrying the truth in silence. 1 moment of revelation. That was the equation. 2 years passed. Time moved differently now. Katie took over Sacred Heart's veteran outreach program, running it from an office overlooking Portland where the rain fell like benediction and the light came in clean through the windows. On her wall hung a framed photograph, the general kneeling before her in that ICU, his hand over his heart, the entire staff standing at attention behind him. Beside it was something older, a faded unit patch, the same one sewn inside her old combat jacket lining, no longer hidden, no longer a secret carried in darkness. Emma started nursing school that fall, her white coat fitting with a kind of ease that came from watching someone do it with absolute authority. In her clinical rotations, she'd tell her preceptors casually, "My mother was a senior chief petty officer. Navy SEAL. Saved a general's life with a needle and her experience." The preceptors would nod, not quite believing it, then watch Katie during one of her monthly visits to the hospital, and suddenly their doubt would evaporate. Jennifer, Marcus, and Diane, the nurses who'd abandoned Katie in the break room, who'd written their shame into 2 years of service in her program, had earned something they didn't quite have a name for. Not forgiveness. Katie had forgiven them the moment they made their choice to distance themselves. What they'd earned was the opportunity to be better. They worked Katie's veteran outreach program with the intensity of people doing atonement. Outside a strip mall across town, in a section of Portland that didn't see much foot traffic, Dr. Sterling sat at a folding table selling supplemental insurance policies. His medical career had ended not with a bang but with permanent revocation of his license, the weight of federal conviction pressing down on every job application, every future, every second of every day. A former Sacred Heart nurse passed his table, recognized him, kept walking without breaking stride. Sterling had learned something important. Power that comes from manipulation is power that vanishes the moment someone with actual strength shows up. Katie hosted a ceremony for incoming veteran patients on a Tuesday in March, 2 years and 14 days after the general had whispered her call sign. She spoke quietly, her voice had changed completely now, deepened, carrying the frequency of absolute certainty. This hospital failed me when I needed support. Not because people here are cruel. Because they didn't see who was standing in front of them. We'll never fail you. That's a promise. The general added from the back row, his posture still military straight, his presence still commanding. She taught us that true class is what you do when the lights go out. His eyes found Katie's across the room. Not what you do when people are watching. What you do when nobody will ever know. Katie's hand brushed the unit patch on her wall, no longer a secret, no longer a source of pain. Just a reminder of who she'd been and who she'd chosen to become. Emma stood beside her mother in new scrubs, clinical rotation underway, ready to carry forward a legacy of service that had been forged in silence and vindicated in light. The ICU halls at night were quieter now. Katie walked them without limping, without flinching at the sound of helicopters landing on the roof. She moved through the darkness like she owned it, greeting each veteran patient by name, checking vitals with hands that had learned their steadiness through harder places than hospitals could ever create. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with a different frequency, or maybe Katie had just learned to hear them differently. Either way, the darkness couldn't touch her anymore. If you've ever carried a secret about who you really are, if you've ever had to prove yourself to people who didn't believe in you, if you've ever wanted to tell the truth but couldn't, subscribe to see more stories like Katie's. These stories matter. Like and comment below, what would you have done if you were standing in that break room when the nurses walked out? And hit subscribe so you never miss when ordinary people reveal themselves to be anything but ordinary.